Martenyi, and this is a new episode of My Pride, My Story. My guest today is Jeff Tucker, and before he became an IML contest coordinator and then he was himself IML 1994. We're going to talk about his coming out and how he's helping the community since then. Jeff, tell us about your childhood. When did you notice first that you are different than the other kids?
The first time I felt different, I would say 7 years old. I found that I met a cousin of mine for the first time, and there was something unusual about our relationship. He was an 8-year-old cousin of mine, and somehow we interacted differently than I had with any other relative.
And then you started to question yourself or looking for answers?
I knew that I had attractions that were different than my older brother, and I grew up in a military family. So looking around me, I realized that I was unlike a lot of the other boys, and I didn't quite understand it yet, but I knew that somehow I was different.
And when was the moment that you realized that you like boys, that you're gay?
I realized what I didn't like, actually, first. There were a group of young kids, encouraged by my older brother and some older cousins and friends, when the parents were all away, and they decided that they were going to explore things sexually. And those of us that were younger still were in the background, and it was very uncomfortable for me. One, because I was being encouraged to participate in something that I didn't understand, but I also didn't like. And I realized when I had my other young cousin nearby that I found comfort in sort of hiding out in the background with him. And we offered each other a sense of comfort, but there was also something in the way we held each other that I realized we were different. And neither of us was comfortable in what was happening. And of course, I look back and it could have been just the fact that we were so young. And this was sort of behavior that was not intended for our age, perhaps. But nonetheless, it was uncomfortable. And I discovered that there was something different about he and I just didn't know what it was yet.
You mentioned that you are coming from a military family. Does it mean that you had strict parents?
I remember my father was an officer, so if I ever did anything, the information about it would get home before I did. But he was a very reasonable man. But he was also a very affectionate man, which surprises a lot of people when I say I had a military upbringing. He was affectionate with me, but not with my older brother. We were raised very differently. And he always said that there was a consequence for every action and every behavior. And that before you do whatever you're thinking of doing, know that there is a consequence. So decide up front if you want to get yourself in trouble or not. But he would never yell. He was just always very clear. It was okay or it was not okay. So I learned from an early age how to look at my situation and judge the potential consequence.
Then around the age of 12, you came out for yourself. What did you feel? And were you afraid of the reaction of your parents?
Well, unfortunately, my father passed when I was young. Shortly after this experience with my cousin, my father committed suicide. So I didn't have an opportunity to really discuss much with him as I grew up. So I was left to figure it out on my own. But I did not discuss the differences I was feeling when I was growing up. As a teenager, we lived in ranching country. So we didn't have the urban, setting to have exposure to other things. It was mostly, guys are being taught how to shoot rifles, ride horses, ride, ATVs out in the field and that sort of thing, which I was very good at, but I was also always the outsider. I never felt like I fit in.
And how was it at school? Did you have friends or you were more a loner type of guy?
I did really well in school. Knowing that I was different, and again, at 12 years old, I was very clear how I was different. I also knew that it wasn't going to be okay with most people because I could just hear what they were saying around me. So I became very good at everything I did, and I became an overachiever. So I decided I was going to be better than these people who were calling my friends names, even though I couldn't admit that they were my friends, but I didn't like that they were being called names. So I actually became a very good fighter, a very good marksman. I could outride most of my friends, and even the ones older than me. Uh, and just I just had this drive to become better than they were. And at that point, they didn't pick on me because I was better than they were, and I could fight my way out of the situation. And they didn't like that either because if they called me names, I'd probably punch them. So there was a certain advantage and a real disadvantage to that process because I never got to truly be myself. I was always striving to be better at something, whether it was something I really wanted to do or not.
How did your life change in your teenage years?
I was living in an environment that I was very comfortable with and I knew. And in school, I met this young boy who was a year older than I was. So I guess you would say I was into older men. And he and I explored together and discovered what this thing was that was going on in a physical sense. And because of that, I learned more about what it meant intellectually and emotionally. I never really thought about leaving where I was living. You know, it's very, conservative environment, and not exactly the greatest place for gay people to live because there's nothing gay about it. Um, but he moved away at the end of the school year, and I missed him so much and grieved the loss of our friendship so much, that at that point, by the time I turned 13, I didn't want to be out in the middle of ranching country anymore. I wanted to be, well, where he was, but I wanted to be in the city.
Did you convince your mother and the rest of the family to move, or how long did you have to wait?
My life became very difficult. My mother responded to my father's suicide in a very bad way. She became addicted to antidepressants and also alcohol. A lot of the people where I grew up have a lot of addiction issues, um, not uncommon to the area. Drinking's just what you do. It's one of the things and one of the few things that people had. I so I grew up with a lot of abuse. She had abusive partners. They were abusive to me. Um, I had one stepfather who believed that I was gay before I knew the words and what they really meant. I just knew that they were things that you called people that were, just not nice things to say. And he decided that I should suck his penis. And I thought it wasn't something I wanted to do. And yet he was really forceful about it. And that told me um, right away that there was a big conflict, and it made it hard for me because there was something I wanted, but yet he, because of that behavior, forcing himself on me, made me feel like now there was something bad. And so for the first time, I felt really conflicted about this thing that was happening with me. Um, but from that moment on, I also knew that when the time came, I would leave. And on my 18th birthday, I had not yet graduated from high school. It was a few months to go. And on my 18th birthday, I had my bags packed. My mother came home probably about 3 a.m. in the morning. Um, and I let her know I was leaving. And so from my very first day of 18, I left home. I graduated high school, and 3 days later, I moved away from Nevada. I was no longer wanting to live out in the country like that anymore. And so I've never gone back.
You're not keeping contact with your family.
No, my older brother and I are not close. I do have two younger brothers, and we were close for a while. I used to have them come and visit me in the summer when they were young, while they were still in school. But we aren't close now. They're very conservative politically. They're very different than I am. They live very differently than I do. They live in very small communities of very restrictive thinking, and it's not a place I want to be. And I decided several years ago that it was okay, that we didn't have to be friends. Um, my mother and I, however, our relationship improved. It took many years, but she and I actually developed a very good relationship. And so much so that she became part of the leather community and the gay community in a way that she was making blankets for fundraisers, and she crocheted leather dick and ball cozies, and so we went to a very different place together later in life, but we went for many years without speaking, and I was okay with that because my life was working for me.
When you left, you immediately started to live a life being out.
As soon as my friend moved away from Nevada, and I didn't have him around anymore, um, I decided when I was 15 years old that I would come out. And when you live around a bunch of cowboys, that's probably not the best thing to do. And when you live in a very small place where there aren't probably going to be a lot of other gay people, not the best thing to do. But because I was an overachiever and I was better at writing and better at sports and better at some things, like I was a straight A student, they wanted my friendship, because it was better to be friends with the guy who was better than you than to call him names, because then the guy that you're calling gay is actually better than you, Mr. Straight Boy. And I used that to my advantage. I even became the student body president in my high school. Um, so I was an overachiever.
How did you find the leather community? Does it come from your cowboy background?
Well, that's the funny thing is I always had this cowboy thing. I had my cowboy hat, I had my chaps, I had things that were very cowboy, and I fit right in to the leather community. I also had a motorcycle and rode, so I had my motorcycle jacket, and it just seemed to be a place that I fit naturally. So I never really tried to fit in. I just showed up. Um, I My first leather bar was actually in New York City, um, and I didn't I didn't dress appropriately at all. And the bartender moved me to the end of the bar where I could have my back, where I could watch the room, and just see what was happening. But I must have looked really silly to all those people, because I think I was wearing white shorts and some white tennis shoes and a Lacoste shirt or something like that. I know I stood out, um, but I held my own. Again, I was very confident as a young man, because I had to be strong, and so I was confident. So it didn't frighten me to be there. I just wish that I had worn something different. Um, and it was really, I then went from New York City to San Francisco. So I definitely went from one of the worst possible places to two of the best possible places. Um, and it wasn't until we were really in the AIDS crisis that the leather community and I really became one. That's when I really felt like I was part of the leather community, because I met some people in San Francisco that sort of took me under their wing, guided me through a lot of processes that I was dealing with, um, and made me feel at home. And so I never felt like I had to fit in. I just sort of showed up. And then I, of course, had to come out to friends and family once again.
What do you think, your first coming out or your coming out as a fetish person was harder?
I think coming out as a leather person was harder, um, because my coming out as a gay person was an act of defiance. and I was just going to show you I could do whatever I wanted. Um, Coming out as a leather person was far more difficult because there was so much stigma around it. People didn't want to have anything to do with me because I was one of them. But then I quickly realized that they were saying the same thing about drag queens, and they were saying the same thing about anybody who was different than whatever their group was. And it became okay. I decided it didn't matter, and that I would go where I was most comfortable.
Do you think the stigma came from the AIDS outbreak? Because in the 80s, the AIDS outbreak created a big panic, or it was more that the people wanted to put you in a box?
Generally speaking, people wanted everyone to fit comfortably into their box. They wanted to be able to define you. And being gay was still very uncomfortable for a lot of people in the 80s. And if you stood out, then you felt their their anger, because they didn't want you to represent them if you were a leather person. They didn't want you to represent them if you were a drag queen, because they weren't any of those things. They were just normal people, or whatever normal is. And I was a normal person too. I was just expressing myself differently than they were. And because we drew attention to ourselves, that made them very uncomfortable, because they didn't want attention drawn to them. They wanted to try to be gay, but live under the radar. And the 80s made it very clear that that was impossible. We could no longer do that. We could not, because of the AIDS crisis, live under the radar, nor should we. And it was a time when we were fighting for our lives, and the US government was not going to help us. And it became clear that if we were going to get through a very difficult period, we were going to do it ourselves. And when I saw the leather community really fighting to stay alive, and even in the midst of it, when so many people were dying around them, all my friends were working so hard to help each other. And I realized that's the kind of human being that I believed I was. And that's when I knew that's where I belonged.
Do you think the AIDS crisis changed you?
It changed me in many ways. Um, One, I realized how vulnerable I was. And for the first time, I was afraid, really afraid. Um, as a child, I learned how to, handle a gun, handle my fists, able to ride, and I knew I could fight back. And for the very first time in my life, I felt like I was vulnerable in a way that I had no defense whatsoever. And so for the first time, I knew what it was like to be afraid, to really be afraid for my life. And it helped me understand, when we were working hard together, when we were all working to do what we could to raise money, to help our friends who were sick, to help bring awareness to something that people wanted to ignore. It really helped me understand what I had inside, and what I believed in. And I was, in many ways, now I'm grateful, but in many ways at the time, I realized how little I really knew about life. So I learned a lot. It toughened me up in a different way. But I think it prepared me in many ways that I had no idea, that I was not ready for. But it definitely groomed me.
But somehow you survived and you became an active part of the LGBTQ plus community.
Um, it's funny. I lost my partner in 1984, and to AIDS, and that advocacy really helped me. My career took off. I did really well in corporate America in the high tech industry. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and lived in the Silicon Valley. So my career was doing well. I was the person in charge of my gay and lesbian association at work, and helped to really move things forward. Um, I've been involved in now 27 different nonprofit organizations, either helping to form them or helping to advance them. It became my cause. What I believed in and what my life was about became my cause. not just something that I did socially. And of course, in 1994, I walked onto a stage and made a speech that was well received, very well received, and not something I had expected. And becoming International Mr. Leather gave me a whole different opportunity to talk to more people and to do more things. It put me on television. It gave me radio spots, and I was able to say more. And having a background from business and having a company that supported me with who I was really helped. And it helped media accept me because I wasn't radical. And so they were just putting a normal guy in front of their camera or on the other side of the microphone. And they were able to give me credentials, and then their audience would listen. So I realized that I had been given an opportunity, and I took advantage of it. I really did. As IML, I really took advantage of what was in front of me, and I ran with it. I also, during that time, had decided I wanted to be a parent. So I am the biological parent to a young girl who is no longer a young girl, 38 years old now. And my partner and I of 30 years also became one of the first male couples to have to bring our son into our home and to start the legal grounds of adoption. So I was a family guy. So I wasn't just the leather guy and just the weirdo. I was also someone who was professional, who had a family, and I guess in some ways I was more acceptable. And I didn't like that, but I was going to use that to help people understand that it had nothing to do with any of those things. Being gay is not a bad thing, and I was able to put it out there. And somehow talking as a leather man to an organization or to a group of people, and then bringing up the conversation about being gay, because they were having a little bit of a struggle with the leather part, they accepted the conversation about the gay part. You know, so it was like they were choosing between the two things that I represented and allowed me to talk about being gay, because they didn't necessarily want to talk about my leather and kink. So it was very good for me. It changed my life, and I, as you know, I've been involved with IML ever since. So it's been very good for me, and the last few years have been terrific because I've had an opportunity, or I created an opportunity for myself to travel to Europe more, to learn about the European culture around leather, and we've opened up a lot of dialogue and had an opportunity to talk a lot more about how we're alike and how we're different, and how both of those things help each of us. And I think there's a lot more people going to Europe now for events because we're creating more and more exposure. And I think the opposite is true. I think people are coming to the United States more, albeit not everywhere in the United States, but at least in a few of the places where it's still positive to be a leather person.
Let's move to our next question. How old were you when you went to your first Pride, and how was the experience?
Well, my first Pride experience was an accident. I found out that the young man that I had my first sort of physical encounter with was just outside San Francisco, and I had a car. And not knowing anything about gay pride, nobody had told me anything about gay pride. I didn't know what that was, and I was still in high school. I mean, I agreed to drive to California so we could see each other. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was going to do. I went. And when I got to San Francisco, it was, I'm not even sure why I had the time off. I was out of school, and for some reason it was a gap. And I arrived on the weekend of Gay Pride and had no idea. And I had a convertible car. And this drag queen with this big, huge chiffon dress, and I mean huge dress, looked like a wedding cake. And she runs up, had this big voice, and just said, you want to go to a parade? And jumped in my car, and I actually drove her in the Pride Parade on the back of my car with this wind blowing this dress in my face. And I had my first gay pride experience as the chauffeur for a wedding cake. It was amazing. And hearing people cheering, seeing the signs, seeing people get excited about something that I couldn't get that excited about, really did something for me. It really did. It was wonderful to see people happy and grateful to be who they were, even though other people didn't want them to be.
What do you think? Is it a good thing that the prides are more a festival, a parade, and not a protest? Is there still something to fight for?
I think we have to make sure that when we have pride, it's important for us to celebrate, because many of us are working a lot in the background within French communities and trying to help communities to be seen and to move forward. And I think that work is very important, but I think we have to have both. There has to be an opportunity to celebrate, because if we don't have an opportunity to celebrate, how do we recharge our batteries? How do we really know that we've accomplished something? And it's through those celebrations that I believe we recognize where we are and where we've been. The challenge is we have these other areas where we must work with people of color being seen, trans people being seen, and not just seen, but appreciated for who they are, like or not like, it doesn't have anything to do with it, but just being seen and appreciated. That's a lot of work to still be done. I work with at-risk LGBTQIA youth, and they're all abused, and their needs have to be seen. But if all we're doing is working hard on those issues, then we'll lose our energy. I think we need the celebration as a way of charging our batteries, or as a way of stepping aside for a moment and just taking a breath. So I think we need both. I think they each have equal value.
And what do you think at the moment? What is the most important thing to fight for in the US?
Honestly, I don't even think the issue is about anything gay anymore, or anything leather, or anything. I think what's really the issue now is understanding that people do not fall either 100% liberal or 100% conservative. I think what's happening is we have a political movement, and especially in the United States, that has polarized a population to believe that you have to be 100% of one thing or another. And the word hate is being used. I hate liberals. I hate conservatives. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think any of us fall 100% anywhere. And we have the struggle now is not to be so polarized, and not to feel like it's either us or them. I really feel like that's the real battle right now, we can't see an issue if we're only seeing the extremes. And we can't have people deciding that they hate something or love something and ignore where the middle is, which is where the problem is. And if we need work, we need to do the work. And right now, I think the biggest problem is that people are fighting from these polar opposite places, and everything in the middle is being ignored and getting lost.